Classic Horror Stories. Read by David Rintoul, Nigel Davenport, Andrew Sachs, and Rula Lenska.
Matteo Falcone by Prosper Mérimée. On leaving Porto Vecchio from the northwest and directing his steps towards the interior of the island, the traveller will notice that the land rises rapidly, and after 3 hours walking over tortuous paths obstructed by great masses of rock and sometimes cut by ravines, he will find himself on the border of a great macabre. The macabre is the domain of the Corsican shepherds and of those who are at variance with justice. It must be known that in order to save himself the trouble of manuring his field, the Corsican husbandman sets fire to a piece of woodland. If the flame spread farther than is necessary, so much the worse. In any case, he is certain of a good crop from the land fertilized by the ashes of the trees which grow upon it. He gathers only the heads of his grain, leaving the straw, which it would be unnecessary labour to cut. In the following spring, the roots that have remained in the earth without being destroyed send up their tufts of sprouts, which in a few years reach a height of 7 or 8 feet. It is this kind of tangled thicket that is called a macabre. It is made up of different kinds of trees and shrubs, so crowded and mingled together at the caprice of nature, that only with an axe in hand can a man open a passage. So thick and bushy is it that the wild sheep themselves cannot penetrate it. If you have killed a man, go into the macabre of Porto Vecchio. With a good gun and plenty of powder and balls, you can live there in safety. Do not forget a brown cloak furnished with a hood, which will serve you for both cover and mattress. The shepherds will give you chestnuts, milk, and cheese, and you will have nothing to fear from justice, nor the relatives of the dead, except when it is necessary for you to descend to the city to replenish your ammunition. When I was in Corsica, Matteo Falcone had his house half a league from this macabre. He was rich enough for that country, living in noble style, that is to say, doing nothing, on the income from his flocks, which the shepherds, who are a kind of nomad, lead to pasture here and there on the mountains. When I saw him 2 years after the event that I am about to relate, he appeared to me to be about 50 years old or more. Picture to yourself a man, small but robust, with curly hair, black as jet, an aquiline nose, thin lips, large, restless eyes, and a complexion the colour of tanned leather. His skill as a marksman was considered extraordinary, even in his country, where good shots are so common. For example, Matteo would never fire at a sheep with buckshot, but at 120 paces he would drop it with a ball in the head or shoulder, as he chose. He used his arms as easily at night as during the day. I was told this feat of his skill, which will perhaps seem impossible to those who have not travelled in Corsica. A lighted candle was placed at 80 paces, behind a paper transparency about the size of a plate. He would take aim, then the candle would be extinguished, and at the end of a moment, in the most complete darkness, he would fire and hit the paper 3 times out of 4. With such a transcendent accomplishment, Matteo Falcone had acquired a great reputation. He was said to be as good a friend as he was a dangerous enemy. Accommodating and charitable, he lived at peace with all the world in the district of Porto Vecchio. But it is said of him that in Corte, where he had married his wife, he had disembarrassed himself very vigorously of a rival who was considered as redoubtable in war as in love. At least, a certain gunshot, which surprised this rival as he was shaving before a little mirror hung in his window, was attributed to Matteo. The affair was smoothed over, and Matteo was married. His wife, Giuseppa, had given him at first 3 daughters, which infuriated him, and finally a son, whom he named Fortunato, and who became the hope of this family, the inheritor of the name. The daughters were well married. Their father could count at need on the poignards and carbines of his sons-in-law. The son was only 10 years old, but he already gave promise of fine attributes. On a certain day in autumn, Matteo set out at an early hour with his wife to visit one of his flocks in a clearing of the macabre. The little Fortunato wanted to go with them, but the clearing was too far away. Moreover, it was necessary someone should stay to watch the house, Therefore the father refused. It will be seen whether or not he had reason to repent. He'd been gone some hours, and the little Fortunato was tranquilly stretched out in the sun, looking at the blue mountains, and thinking that the next Sunday he was going to dine in the city with his uncle, the caporal, when he was suddenly interrupted in his meditations by the firing of a musket. He got up, and turned to that side of the plain whence the noise came. Other shots followed, fired at irregular intervals, and each time nearer. At last, in the path which led from the plain to Matteo's house, appeared a man wearing the pointed hat of the mountaineers, bearded, covered with rags, and dragging himself along with difficulty by the support of his gun. He just received a wound in his thigh. This man was an outlaw, who, having gone to the town by night to buy powder, had fallen on the way into an ambuscade of Corsican light infantry. After a vigorous defence, he was fortunate in making his retreat, closely followed, and firing from rock to rock. But he was only a little in advance of the soldiers, and his wound prevented him from gaining the Marquis before being overtaken. He approached Fortunato and said, "You're the son of Matteo Falcone?" "Yes." "I am Gianetto Salpiero. I'm followed by the yellow collars. Hide me, for I can go no farther." "And what will my father say if I hide you without his permission?" "He will say that you've done well." "How do you know?" "Hide me quickly, they're coming." "Wait till my father gets back." "How can I wait? Malediction, they will be here in 5 minutes. Come, hide me, or I will kill you." Fortunato answered him with the utmost coolness. "Your gun is empty, and there are no more cartridges in your belt." "I have my stiletto." "But can you run as fast as I can?" He gave a leap and put himself out of reach. "You are not the son of Matteo Falcone. Will you then let me be captured before your house?" The child appeared moved. "What will you give me if I hide you?" said he, coming nearer. The outlaw felt in a leather pocket that hung from his belt, and took out a 5-franc piece, which he had doubtless saved to buy ammunition with. Fortunato smiled at the sight of the silver piece. He snatched it, and said to Gianetto, "Fear nothing." Immediately he made a great hole in a pile of hay that was near the house. Gianetto crouched down in it, and the child covered him in such a way that he could breathe without it being possible to suspect that the hay concealed a man. He bethought himself further, and with the subtlety of a tolerably ingenious savage, placed a cat and her kittens on the pile, that it might not appear to have been recently disturbed. Then, noticing the traces of blood on the path near the house, he covered them carefully with dust, and that done, he again stretched himself out in the sun with the greatest tranquillity. A few moments afterwards, 6 men in brown uniforms with yellow collars, and commanded by an adjutant, were before Matteo's door. This adjutant was a distant relative of Falcone's. In Corsica, the degrees of relationship are followed much further than elsewhere. His name was Teodoro Gamba. He was an active man, much dreaded by the outlaws, several of whom he had already entrapped. "Good day, little cousin," said he, approaching Fortunato. "Ah, how tall you've grown! Have you seen a man go past here just now?" "Oh, I'm not yet so tall as you, my cousin," replied the child with a simple air. "You soon will be. But haven't you seen a man go by here, tell me?" "If I have seen a man go by?" "Yes, a man with a pointed hat of black velvet, and a vest embroidered with red and yellow." "A man with a pointed hat and a vest embroidered with red and yellow?" "Yes, answer quickly, and don't repeat my questions." "This morning the curé passed before our door on his horse, Piero. He asked me how Papa was, and I answered him—" "Ah, you little scoundrel, you're playing sly. Tell me quickly which way Gianetto went. We're looking for him, and I'm sure he took this path." "Who knows?" "Who knows? But as I know that you've seen him." "Can anyone see who passes when they're asleep?" "You were not asleep, rascal. The shooting woke you up." "Then you believe, cousin, that your guns make so much noise? My father's carbine has the advantage of them." "The devil take you, you cursed little scapegrace! I'm certain that you've seen Gianetto. Perhaps even you've hidden him, eh? Come, comrades, go into the house and see if our man is there. He can only go on 1 foot, and the knave has too much good sense to try to reach the Marquis limping like that. Moreover, the bloody tracks stop here." "And what will Papa say?" asked Fortunato with a sneer. What will he say if he knows that his house has been entered while he was away?"
"You rascal," said the adjutant, taking him by the ear. "You know that it only remains for me to make you change your tone. Perhaps you'll speak differently after I've given you 20 blows with the flat of my sword."
Fortunato continued to sneer. "My father is Matteo Falcone," said he with emphasis.
"You little scamp, you know very well that I can carry you off to Corte or to Bastia. I'll make you lie in a dungeon on straw with your feet in shackles, and I will have you guillotined if you don't tell me where Giannetto is."
The child burst out laughing at this ridiculous menace. He repeated, "My father is Matteo Falcone." "Adjutant," said one of the soldiers in a low voice, "let us have no quarrels with Matteo." Gamba appeared evidently embarrassed. He spoke in an undertone with the soldiers who had already visited the house. This was not a very long operation, for the cabin of a Corsican consists only of a single square room, furnished with a table, some benches, chests, housekeeping utensils, and those of the chase. In the meantime, little Fortunato petted his cat, and seemed to take a wicked enjoyment in the confusion of the soldiers and of his cousin. One of the men approached the pile of hay. He saw the cat, and gave the pile a careless thrust with his bayonet, shrugging his shoulders as if he felt that his precaution was ridiculous. Nothing moved. The boy's face betrayed not the slightest emotion. The adjutant and his troop were cursing their luck. Already they were looking in the direction of the plain, as if disposed to return by the way they had come, when their chief, convinced that menaces would produce no impression on Falcone's son, determined to make a last effort and try the effect of caresses and presents.
"My little cousin," said he, "you're a very wide-awake little fella. You'll get along. But you're playing a naughty game with me, and if I wasn't afraid of making trouble for my cousin Matteo, the devil take me, but I would carry you off with me. Ta! But when my cousin comes back, I shall tell him about this, and he will whip you till the blood comes for having told such lies."
"You don't say so."
"You will see. But hold on. Be a good boy, and I will give you something."
"Cousin, let me give you some advice. If you wait much longer, Giannetto will be in the Macchi, and it will take a smarter man than you to follow him." The adjutant took from his pocket a silver watch worth about 10 crowns, and noticing that Fortunato's eyes sparkled at the sight of it, said, holding the watch by the end of its steel chain, "Rascal, you'd like to have such a watch as that hung around your neck, wouldn't you? And to walk in the streets of Porto Vecchio proud as a peacock? People would ask you what time it was, and you would say, 'Look at my watch.'" "When I am grown up, my uncle, the caporal, will give me a watch."
"Yes, but your uncle's little boy has one already, not so fine as this either, but then he is younger than you."
The child sighed.
"Well, would you like this watch, little cousin?"
Fortunato, casting sidelong glances at the watch, resembled a cat that has been given a whole chicken. It feels that it's being made sport of, and doesn't dare to use its claws. From time to time it turns its eyes away so as not to be tempted, licking its jaws all the while, and has the appearance of saying to its master, "How cruel your joke is." However, the adjutant seemed in earnest in offering his watch. Fortunato did not reach out his hand for it, but said with a bitter smile, "Why do you make fun of me?"
"Good God, I'm not making fun of you. Only tell me where Giannetto is, and the watch is yours."
Fortunato smiled incredulously, and fixing his black eyes on those of the adjutant, tried to read there the faith he ought to have had in his words.
"May I lose my epaulets," cried the adjutant, "if I do not give you the watch on this condition. These comrades are witnesses, I cannot deny it."
While speaking, he gradually held the watch nearer till it almost touched the child's pale face, which plainly showed the struggle that was going on in his soul between covetousness and respect for hospitality. His breast swelled with emotion. He seemed about to suffocate. Meanwhile the watch was slowly swaying and turning, sometimes brushing against his cheek. Finally, his right hand was gradually stretched towards it. The ends of his fingers touched it. Then his whole weight was in his hand, the adjutant still keeping hold of the chain. The face was light blue, the cases newly burnished. In the sunlight it seemed to be all on fire. The temptation was too great. Fortunato raised his left hand and pointed over his shoulder with his thumb at the hay against which he was reclining. The adjutant understood him at once. He dropped the end of the chain, and Fortunato felt himself the sole possessor of the watch. He sprang up with the agility of a deer and stood 10 feet from the pile, which the soldiers began at once to overturn. There was a movement in the hay, and a bloody man with a poignard in his hand appeared. He tried to rise to his feet, but his stiffened leg would not permit it, and he fell. The adjutant at once grappled with him and took away his stiletto. He was immediately secured, notwithstanding his resistance. Giannetto, lying on the earth and bound like a faggot, turned his head towards Fortunato, who had approached. "Son of—" said he, with more contempt than anger. The child threw him the silver piece which he had received, feeling that he no longer deserved it. But the outlaw paid no attention to the movement, and with great coolness said to the adjutant, "My dear Gamba, I cannot walk. You will be obliged to carry me to the city." "Just now you could run faster than a buck," answered the cruel captor. "But be at rest. I am so pleased to have you that I would carry you a league on my back without fatigue. Besides, comrade, we're going to make a litter for you, with your cloak and some branches, and at the Crespoli farm we shall find horses." "Good," said the prisoner. "You will also put a little straw on your litter that I may be more comfortable." While some of the soldiers were occupied in making a kind of stretcher out of some chestnut boughs, and the rest were dressing Giannetto's wound, Matteo Falcone and his wife suddenly appeared at a turn in the path that led to the Marquis. The woman was staggering under the weight of an enormous sack of chestnuts, while her husband was sauntering along, carrying one gun in his hands, while another was slung across his shoulders, for it is unworthy of a man to carry other burdens than his arms. At the sight of the soldiers, Matteo's first thought was that they had come to arrest him. But why this thought? Had he then some quarrels with justice? No. He enjoyed a good reputation. He was said to have a particularly good name, but he was a Corsican and a Highlander, and there are few Corsican Highlanders who, in scrutinizing their memory, cannot find some peccadillo, such as a gunshot, dagger thrust, or similar trifles. Matteo more than others had a clear conscience. For more than 10 years he had not pointed his carbine at a man, but he was always prudent, and put himself into a position to make a good defence if necessary. "Wife," said he to Giuseppe, "put down the sack and hold yourself ready." She obeyed at once. He gave her the gun that was slung across his shoulders, which would have bothered him, and, cocking the one he held in his hands, advanced slowly towards the house, walking among the trees that bordered the road, ready at the least hostile demonstration to hide behind the largest, whence he could fire from under cover. His wife followed closely behind, holding his reserve weapon and his cartridge-box. The duty of a good housekeeper, in case of a fight, is to load her husband's carbines. On the other side, the adjutant was greatly troubled to see Matteo advance in this manner, with cautious steps, his carbine raised, and his finger on the trigger. If by chance, thought he, Matteo should be related to Giannetto, or if he should be his friend and wish to defend him, the contents of his 2 guns would arrive amongst us as certainly as a letter in the post, and if he should see me, notwithstanding the relationship. In his perplexity he took a bold step. It was to advance alone towards Matteo, and tell him of the affair while accosting him as an old acquaintance. But the short space that separated him from Matteo seemed terribly long. "Hello, old comrade!" cried he. "How do you do, my good fellow? It is I, Gamba, your cousin." Without answering a word, Matteo stopped, and in proportion as the other spoke, slowly raised the muzzle of his gun so that it was pointing upwards when the adjutant joined him. "Good day, brother," said the adjutant, holding out his hand. "It's a long time since I've seen you." "Good day, brother." "I stopped while passing to say good day to you and to cousin Pepper here. We've had a long journey today, but have no reason to complain, for we've captured a famous prize. We've just seized Giannetto Salpiero." "God be praised!" cried Giuseppe. "He stole a milch goat from us last week." These words reassured Gamba. "Poor devil," said Matteo. "He was hungry." "Oh, the villain fought like a lion," continued the adjutant, a little mortified. "He killed one of my soldiers, and not content with that, broke Caporal Chardon's arm. But that matters little, he's only a Frenchman. Then, too, he was so well hidden that the devil couldn't have found him. Without my little cousin, Fortunato, I should never have discovered him." "Fortunato?" cried Matteo. "Fortunato. repeated Giuseppe.
Yes, Gianetto was hidden under the hay-pile yonder, but my little cousin showed me the trick. I shall tell his uncle, the caporal, that he may send him a fine present for his trouble. Both his name and yours will be in the report that I shall send to the Attorney General." "Malediction," said Matteo in a low voice.
They had rejoined the detachment. Gianetto was already lying on the litter, ready to set out. When he saw Matteo and Gamba in company, he smiled a strange smile. Then, turning his head towards the door of the house, he spat on the sill, saying, "House of a traitor!" Only a man determined to die would dare pronounce the word traitor to Falcone. A good blow with a stiletto, which there would be no need of repeating, would have immediately paid the insult. However, Matteo made no other movement than to place his hand on his forehead like a man who is dazed. Fortunato had gone into the house when his father arrived, but now he reappeared with a bowl of milk, which he handed with downcast eyes to Gianetto.
"Get away from me!"
cried the outlaw in a loud voice. Then, turning to one of the soldiers, he said, "Comrade, give me a drink." The soldier placed his gourd in his hands, and the prisoner drank the water handed to him by a man with whom he had just exchanged bullets. He then asked them to tie his hands across his breast instead of behind his back.
"I like," said he, "to lie at my ease."
They hastened to satisfy him. Then the adjutant gave the signal to start, said adieu to Matteo, who did not respond, and descended with rapid steps towards the plain. Nearly 10 minutes elapsed before Matteo spoke. The child looked with restless eyes, now at his mother, now at his father, who was leaning on his gun and gazing at him with an expression of concentrated rage. "You begin well," said Matteo at last with a calm voice, but frightful to one who knew the man.
"Oh, father!"
cried the boy, bursting into tears, and making a forward movement as if to throw himself on his knees. But Matteo cried, "Away from me!" The little fellow stopped and sobbed, immovable, a few feet from his father. Giuseppe drew near. She had just discovered the watch-chain, the end of which was hanging out of Fortunato's jacket. "Who gave you that watch?" demanded she in a severe tone.
"My cousin, the adjutant."
Falcone seized the watch and smashed it in 1,000 pieces against a rock. "Wife," said he, "is this my child?" Giuseppe's cheeks turned a brick red.
"What are you saying, Matteo? Do you know to whom you speak?"
"Very well. This child is the first of his race to commit treason." Fortunato's sobs and gasps redoubled as Falcone kept his lynx eyes upon him. Then he struck the earth with his gunstock, shouldered the weapon, and turned in the direction of the Marquis, calling to Fortunato to follow. The boy obeyed. Giuseppe hastened after Matteo and seized his arm.
"He is your son,"
said she with a trembling voice, fastening her black eyes on those of her husband to read what was going on in his heart. "Leave me alone," said Matteo. "I am his father." Giuseppe embraced her son, and, bursting into tears, entered the house. She threw herself on her knees before an image of the Virgin and prayed ardently. In the meanwhile Falcone walked some 200 paces along the path, and only stopped when he reached a little ravine, which he descended. He tried the earth with the butt end of his carbine, and found it soft and easy to dig. The place seemed to be convenient for his design. "Fortunato, go close to that big rock there." The child did as he was commanded. Then he kneeled. "Say your prayers."
"Oh, Father, do not kill me."
"Say your prayers," repeated Matteo in a terrible voice. The boy, stammering and sobbing, recited the Pater and the Credo. At the end of each prayer the father loudly answered, "Amen." "Are those all the prayers you know?"
"Father, I know the Ave Maria and the litany that my aunt taught me."
"That's very long, but no matter." The child finished the litany in a scarcely audible tone. "Are you finished?"
"Oh, my father, have mercy! Pardon me, I will never do so again. I will beg my cousin the caporal to pardon Gianetto."
He was still speaking. Matteo raised his gun, and taking aim said, "May God pardon you." The boy made a desperate effort to rise and grasp his father's knees, but there was not time. Matteo fired, and Fortunato fell dead. Without casting a glance on the body, Matteo returned to the house for a spade with which to bury his son. He had gone but a few steps when he met Giuseppa, who, alarmed by the shot, was hastening hither. "What have you done?" cried she. "Justice." "Where is he?" "In the ravine. I'm going to bury him. He dies a Christian. I shall have a mass said for him. Have my son-in-law, Teodoro Bianchi, sent for, to come and live with us."
The Bird by Thomas Burke. It is a tale that they tell softly in Pennyfields, when the curtains are drawn and the shapes of the night are shut out. Those who held that Captain Chudder, S.S. Peacock, owners Peter Dubbin and Company, had a devil in him, were justified. But they were nearer the truth who held that his devil was not within him, but at his side, perching at his elbow, moving with him day and night, and prompting him, so it was held, to frightful excesses. His devil wore the shape of a white parrot, a bird of lusty wings and the cruellest of beaks. There were those who whispered that the old man had not always been the man that his crew knew him to be, that he had been a normal, kindly fellow, until he acquired his strange companion in the Solomons. Certainly his maniac moods dated from its purchase, and there was truth in the dark hints of his men that there was something wrong with that damned bird, a kind of something you sort of felt when it looked at you or answered you back. It had a diabolical knack of mimicry, and many a chap would cry, "Yes, George," or "Right, sir," in answer to a commanding voice which chuckled with glee as he came smartly to order. They invariably referred to it as that bloody bird, though actually it had done nothing to merit such opprobrium. When they thought it over calmly, they could think of no harm that it had done to them, nothing to arouse such loathing as every man on the boat felt towards it. It was not spiteful, it was not bad-tempered. Mostly it was in cheery mood, and would chuckle deep in the throat like the captain, or echo or answer quite pleasantly such remarks usually rude as were addressed to it. And yet, somehow, there it was. It was always there, everywhere, and in its speech they seemed to find a sinister tone which left them guessing at the meaning of its words. On one occasion the cook, in the seclusion of the forecastle, had remarked that he would like to wring its neck if he could get hold of it. But old grizzled Snorter had replied that the bird couldn't be killed. There was something about that bird that, well, he betted that no one wouldn't touch that bird without trouble. And a moment of panic stabbed the crowd, as a voice leapt from the sombre shadows of the corner. "That's the style, me old brown son! Don't try to come in with me, what?" and ceased in a spasmodic flutter of white wings. That night, as the cook was ascending the companion, he was caught by a huge sea which swept across the boat from nowhere and dashed him head-on below. For a week he was sick with a broken head, and throughout that week the bird would thrust its beak to the berth where he lay and chortle to him, "Yep, me old brown son, wring his bleeding neck, what? Waltz me round again, will he? Round and round and round." That is the seaman's story, and as the air of Limehouse is thick with seaman's stories, it is not always good to believe them. But it is a widely known fact that on the last voyage the captain did have a devil with him, the foulest of all devils that possess mortal men, not the devil of slaughter, but the devil of cruelty. They were from Swatow to London, and it was noted that he was drinking heavily ashore, and he continued throughout the voyage. He came aboard from Swatow drunk, bringing with him a Chinese boy called Sung Di, also drunk. The greaser, being a big man, kicked him below, and he sat or sprawled in his cabin, with a rum bottle before him, and, on the corner of his chair, the white parrot, which conversed with him, and sometimes fluttered on deck to shout orders in the frightful voice of his master. "Yes," repeated Old Man Snorter sententiously, "I'd run 100 miles before I'd try to monkey with the old man or his bloody bird. There's something about that bird." While the captain remained drunk in his cabin, he kept with him the miserable half-starved Chinese boy whom he had brought aboard. And it would make others sick if the full, dark tale were told here of what the master of the Peacock did to that boy. You may read of monstrosities in police reports of cruelty cases, but the bestialities of Captain Chudder could not be told in words. His orgy of drink and torture lasted till they were berthed in the Thames, and the details remain sharp and clear in the memories of those who witnessed it. At all the ceremonial horrors which were wrought in that wretched cabin, the parrot was present. It jabbered to the old man jabbered back, and gave it an occasional sip of rum from his glass, and the parrot would mimic the boy's entreaties and wag a grave claw at him as he writhed under the ritual of punishment, and when that day's ceremony was finished, it would flutter from bow to stern of the boat, perching here, perching there, simpering and whining, in tune with Sung Dee's placid moaning. Placid, yes, outwardly, but the old man's wickedness had lighted a flame beneath that yellow skin which nothing could quench but the floods of vengeance. Had the old man been a little more cute and a little less drunk, he might have remembered that a Chinaman does not forget. He would have read danger in the face that was so submissive under his devilries. Perhaps he did see it, but, because of the rum that was in him, felt himself secure from the hate of any outcast Chinese, knew that his victim would never once get the chance to repay him, Captain Chudder, master of the Peacock, and one of the very smartest. Sung Dee was alone and weaponless, and dare not come aft without orders. He was master of the boat. He had a crew to help him, and knives and guns, and he had his faithful white bird to warn him. As soon as they docked at Limehouse, he would sling him off or arrange a quick transfer. But he made no attempt to transfer. He just sat below, finished his last 2 bottles, paid off his men, and then after a sleep went ashore to report. Having done that, he set himself seriously to search for amusement. He climbed St. George's, planning a real good booze-up, and the prospect that spread itself before his mind was so compelling that he did not notice a lurking yellow phantom that hung on his shadow. He visited the Baltic on the chance of finding an old pal or so, and, meeting none, he called at a shipping office in Fenchurch Street, where he picked up an acquaintance, and they two returned eastward to Poplar, and the phantom feet supped after them. Through the maze of the London streets and traffic, the shadow slid. It dodged about the captain's little cottage in Gill Street, and when he and others came out and strolled to a bar, and later to a music hall, it flitted, moth-like, around them. Surely, since there is no step in the world that has just the obvious stealth of the Chinaman's, he must have heard those whispering feet. Surely his path was darkened by that shadow. But no. After the music hall, he drifted to a waterside wine shop, and then, with a bunch of others, went wandering. The captain braced himself and promised himself a real glittering night of good fellowship, and from gin-warmed bar to gin-warmed bar he roved, meeting the lurid girls of the places, and taking one of them upstairs. At the last bar his friends, too, went upstairs with their ladies, and it being then 1 o'clock in the morning, he brought a pleasant evening to a close at a certain house in Poplar High Street, where he took an hour's amusement by flinging half-crowns over the fan-tan table. But always the yellow moth was near, and when at 2:30 he came with uncertain steps into the sad street, now darkened and loud only with the drunken, who found unfamiliar turnings in familiar places, the moth buzzed closer and closer. The captain at last found his haven in Gill Street, and his hefty brother, with whom he lived when ashore, shoved him upstairs to his bedroom. He fell across the bed, and the sleep of the swinish held him fast. The grey towers were tolling 3 o'clock. The lamps were pale and few. The waters sucked at the staples of the wharves. One heard the rattle of chains and blocks, mournful hooters, shudders of noise as engines butted lines of trucks at the shunting stations. Captain Chudder slept, mouth open, limbs heavy and nerveless. His room was deeply dark, and so little light shone on the back reaches of the Gill Street cottages that the soft raising of the window made no visible aperture. Into this blank space something rose from below, and soon it took the shape of a flat, yellow face, which hung motionless, peering into the room. Then a yellow hand came through. The aperture was widened, and swiftly and silently a lithe yellow body hauled itself up and slipped over the sill. It glided with outstretched hand from the window, and the moment it touched the bed, its feeling fingers went here and there, and it stood still. Calmly and methodically, a hand moved to its waist and withdrew a crease. The same hand raised the crease and held it poised. It was long, keen, and beautifully curved. Then, with terrific force and speed, it came down. 1, 2, 3. The last breath rushed from the open lips. Captain Chudder was out. The strong yellow hand withdrew the crease for the last time, wiped it on the coverlet of the bed, and replaced it in its home. The figure turned, like a wraith, for the window, and found, in a moment of panic, that it knew not which way to turn. It hesitated for a moment. It thought it heard a sound at the bed. It touched the coverlet and the boots of the captain. All was still. Stretching a hand to the wall, Sung-Dee began to feel his way along. Blank wall was all he found at first. Then his hand touched what seemed to be a picture frame. It swung and clicked. He moved farther, and a sharp rattle told him that he had struck the loose handle of the door. But that was of little help. He could not use the door. It was the window he wanted. Again he heard that sound from the bed. He judged that he was standing in the middle of the room. Momentarily, a sharp shock surged over him. He prayed for matches, and something in his throat was almost crying, "The window! The window!" The middle of the room, he judged, and took another step forward, a step which landed his chin sharply against the jutting edge of the mantel-shelf above the fireplace. He jumped like a cat, and his limbs shook, for now he had lost the door and the bed, as well as the window, and had made noises which might bring disaster. He knew not whether to go forward or backward, to right or left. He heard the shunting trains, and he heard a voice crying something in his own tongue. But he was lapped around by darkness and terror, and a cruel fancy came to him that he would never escape from this suffocating room. And then, sharp and clear at his elbow, came the captain's voice. "Get forward, you damn lousy chink! Get forward! Lively there! Get out of my room!" He sprang aside from the voice that had been the terror of his life for so many weeks, and collided with the door, realized that he had made further fearful noises, dashed away from it and crashed into the bed, fell across it and across the warm, wet body that lay there. Every nerve and every limb of him was seared with horror at the contact, and he leapt off, kicking, writhing. He leapt off and fell against a table which tottered and fell with a stupendous crash into the fender. "Lively, you damn chink," said the captain. "Lively, I tell you. Dance, d'ye hear? I'll have you for this. I'll learn you something with a sharp knife and a bit of hot iron, my cocky. I'll make your yellow skin crackle, you damn lousy chopstick. I'll have you in a minute, and when I get you, off with your clothes, I'll cut you to pieces, I will." Sung-Dee shrieked. He ran round and round, beating the wall with his hands, crying, jumping, while all manner of shapes arose in his path, lit by the grey light of fear. He realized that it was all up now. He cared not how much noise he made. He hadn't killed the old man, only wounded him, and now all he desired was to find the door and any human creatures who might save him. He met the bed again, suddenly, and the tormentor who lay there. He met the upturned table and fell upon it, and he met the fireplace and the blank wall, but never the window or the door. They'd vanished. There was no way out. He was caught in that dark room, and the captain would do as he liked with him. He heard footsteps in the passage, and sounds of menace and alarm below. But to him they were friendly sounds, and he screamed towards them. He cried to the captain in his pidgin for mercy. "Oh, captain! No burn me today, captain! Sung Di be heap good sailor, heap good servant, all same slave. Sung Di heap plenty sorry hurt, captain. Sung Di be good boy. No do fella bad lings, no fella more, oh, captain. Let Sung Di go this time. Let Sung Di go, oh, captain." "But, oh, my God," answered the captain, "bless your yellow heart. Wait till I get you trussed up. Wait till I get you below. I'll learn ya." And now those below came upstairs, and they listened in the passage, and for the space of a minute they were hesitant, for they heard all manner of terrible noises, and there might have been half a dozen fellows in the captain's room. Very soon the screaming and the pattering feet were still, and they heard nothing but low moans. The captain's brother swung the door open and flashed a large lantern. And those who were with him fell back in dumb horror, while the brother cried, "Oh, my God!" For the lantern shone on a Chinaman seated on the edge of the bed. Across his knees lay the dead captain, and the Chinaman was fondling his damp, dead face, talking baby talk to him, and now and then making idiot moans. But what sent the crowd back in horror was that a great death-white thing was flapping about the face of the Chinaman, cackling, "I'll learn ya! I'll learn ya!" and dragging strips of flesh away with its beak.
The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlour of the George at Debenham, the undertaker and the landlord, and Fettes and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would each be planted in his own particular armchair. Fettes was an old drunken Scotsman, a man of education, obviously, and a man of some property, since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlour at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things of course in Debenham. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat, with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. Beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. One dark winter night there was a sick man in the George. A great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor?" "Himself," replied our host. "What is his name?" "Dr. Macfarlane," said the landlord. Fettes was far through his 3rd tumbler, stupidly fuddled, but at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name Macfarlane twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion at the second. "Yes," said the landlord, "that's his name, Dr. Wolfe Macfarlane." Fettes became instantly sober. His eyes awoke, his voice became clear, loud, and steady, his language forcible. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I am afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe Macfarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, "It cannot be. It cannot be," he added, "and yet I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" asked the undertaker with a gasp. "God forbid," was the reply, "and yet the name's a strange one. It were too much to fancy two. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair is white, but he looks younger than you. He is older, though, years older. But," with a slap upon the table, "it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and a good digestion. Conscience! Hear me speak. You would think I was some good, old, decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he had stood in my shoes, but the brains, with a rattling fillip on his bald head, the brains were clear and alive, and I saw and made no deductions." "If you know this, doctor," I ventured to remark, "I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion." Fettes paid no regard to me. "Yes," he said with sudden decision, "I must see him, face to face." There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. "That's the doctor," cried the landlord. "Look sharp, and you can catch him." It was but 2 steps from the small parlour to the door of the Old George Inn. This little space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fettes walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. Macfarlane was alert and vigorous, his white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic, countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch-chain and studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad-folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. It was a surprising contrast to see our parlour sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "Macfarlane!" he said somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Toddy Macfarlane," repeated Fettes. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of scare, and then, in a startled whisper, "Fettes," he said. "You?" "Aye," said the other. "Me. Did you think I was dead, too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance." "Hush, hush!" exclaimed the doctor. "Hush, hush! This meeting is unexpected. I can see you are unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess, at first, but I am overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present it must be how d'ye do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you shall, let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fettes. I fear you're out at elbows, but we must see to that for auld lang syne, as once we sang at suppers." "Money!" cried Fettes. "Money from you! The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it in the rain." Dr. Macfarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance.
"My dear fellow," he said, "be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address, however."
"I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you," interrupted the other. "I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wished to know if, after all, there were a God. I now know that there is none. Begone."
He stood still in the middle of the rug, between the stair and the doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles. But while he still paused, uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlour, huddled by the dormer of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, and made a dart, like a serpent, striking for the door. As he was passing, Fettes clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper, and yet painfully distinct. "Have you seen it again?" The great, rich London doctor cried aloud with a sharp, throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space, and, with his hands over his head, fled out of the door like a detected thief. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces. Next day the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the bar-room window, and Fettes at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "God protect us, Mr. Fettes," said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. "What is all this? These are strange things you have been saying." Fettes turned towards us. He looked us each in succession in the face.
"See if you can hold your tongues," said he. "That man Macfarlane is not safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late."
And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us good-bye and went forth under the lamp of the hotel into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlour, and as we recapitulated what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in the Old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It was no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fettes studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had a talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for its own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. There was, at that period, a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K was then at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fettes believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he had acquired the favour of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant, as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly allusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities, Fettes enjoyed and deserved his notice.
and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator, or sub-assistant, in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theatre and lecture-room developed in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate, affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K. in the same wind, and at last in the same building, with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hand still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone, when they were gone, with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambitions. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had that modicum of prudence, miscalled morality, which keeps a man from drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye-service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomists kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K. to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. "They bring the body, and we pay the price," he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo. And again, "Ask no questions," he would tell his assistants, "for conscience' sake." There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror. But the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was in itself an offence against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fettes, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog, abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before dawn. And, putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, and had fallen at last into that profound, uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain, when he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy, and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fettes, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty!" he cried. "That is Jane Galbraith." The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," asserted one of the men. But the other looked Fettes darkly in the eyes, and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat, or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K.'s instructions and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe Macfarlane, a high favourite among all the restless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had travelled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skilful on the ice or the links. He dressed with nice audacity, and, to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fettes he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in Macfarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting-room. On that particular morning, Macfarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fettes heard him, and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. Macfarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod, "it looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fettes. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything?" "Least said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fettes. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said Macfarlane. "And if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see? And there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud, and you'll get K into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how many of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves, in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that, practically speaking, all our subjects have been murdered." "Macfarlane!" cried Fettes. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself." "Suspecting is one thing, and proof another, yes, I know. And I'm as sorry as you are this should have come here," tapping the body with his cane. "But the next best thing for me is not to recognize it. And," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy that is what K would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives." This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fettes. He agreed to imitate Macfarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fettes dropped into a popular tavern, and found Macfarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realized in his manners, for he proved, upon a nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised a very remarkable control over Macfarlane, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the servility with which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Fettes on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honoured him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a 10th part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I am a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but Macfarlane is the boy. Toddy Macfarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass. Or it might be, Toddy, you jump up and shut the door." "Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh, yes, Toddy, you do." "Don't call me that confounded name," growled Macfarlane. "Hear him! Did you ever see the lad's plain knife? You would like to do that all over my body," remarked the stranger. "We medicals have a better way than that," said Fettes. "When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him." Macfarlane looked up sharply, as though this jest was scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Grey, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fettes to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown in commotion, and when all was done commanded Macfarlane to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man Grey was incapably drunk. Macfarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander, and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fettes, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day Macfarlane was absent from the class, and Fettes smiled to himself as he imagined him still squiring the intolerable Grey from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them nowhere, so he returned early to his rooms and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 in the morning he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find Macfarlane with his gig, and in the gig one of those long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But Macfarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him turn to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, Macfarlane made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You had better look at the face," said he, in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fettes only stared at him in wonder. "But where and how and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fettes was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body, and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death, and naked on that coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left, well clad and full of meat and sin, upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke, even in the thoughtless Fettes, some of the terrors of the conscience. It was a crass tibby which re-echoed in his soul, that two whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolfe. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was Macfarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now, Richardson was a student who had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally. Fettes found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, and on every possible account, you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if all were right. Where does old Kay keep his money?" "There," answered Fettes hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," said the other, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation, and the die was cast. Macfarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key turn between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink and a paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in a drawer a sum suitable to the occasion. "Now look here," he said. "There is the payment made, first proof of your good faith, first step to your security. You have now to clinch it by a second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you, for your part, may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fettes an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with Macfarlane. He set down the candle, which he had been carrying all the time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "And now," said Macfarlane, "it is only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the world has a few shillings extra in his pocket, there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "Macfarlane," began Fettes, still somewhat hoarsely, "I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you." "To oblige me?" cried Wolfe. "Oh, come! You did, as near as I can see the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defence. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Grey is the continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked." A horrible sense of blackness and the treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. "Oh, my God!" he cried. "But what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant, in the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position. Service might have got it. Would he have been where I am now?" "My dear fellow," said Macfarlane, "what a boy you are! What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, do you know what this life is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables, like Grey or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first, but look at Kay. My dear fellow, you're clever. You have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. On my honour and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce." And with that, Macfarlane took his departure and drove off up the Wind in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fettes was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw with inexpressible dismay that there was no limit to his weakness, and that, from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of Macfarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. The secret of Jane Galbraith and the cursed entry in the day-book closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Grey were dealt out to one and to another, and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom rang, Fettes trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. On the third day, Macfarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he made up for the lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson, in particular, he extended the most valuable assistance and advice. Before the week was out, Macfarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fettes had outlived his terrors and forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and Macfarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial. But it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fettes whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which drew the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K. was again short of subjects. Pupils were eager, and it was part of this teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time there came news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glencorse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then, as now, upon the crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighbouring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, the stir of the wind in the mountainous flowering chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use a by-name of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighbourhoods, where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body-snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid in earth there came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fettes and Macfarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting-place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years, and been known for nothing but good butter and a godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight, and carried, dead and naked, to that far-away city that she had always honoured with her Sunday best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members exposed to the last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Penicuik, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whisky with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, and the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the 2 young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass their cordiality increased. Soon Macfarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. "A compliment," he said. "Between friends, these little damned accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights." Fettes pocketed the money and applauded the sentiments to the echo. "You're a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay, between you, by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded Macfarlane. "A man! I tell you, it required a man to back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have turned sick at the look of the damn thing, but not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fettes thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" Macfarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in this boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang. That's practical. But for all cant, Macfarlane, I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all the old gallery of curiosities, they may frighten boys, but men of the world, like you and me, despise them. Here's to the memory of Grey." It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in that direction until they were clear of the last houses of the town, then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course, and followed a by-road towards Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage, and the incessant, strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space, but for the most part it was at a foot pace, groping, they picked their way through that resonant blackness to their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighbourhood of the burying-ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to kindle a match and re-illumine one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees, and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labours. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were rewarded by a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment, Macfarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped, the better to illuminate their labours, against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds, alternately dull and ringing, announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank, and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which it had dislodged in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like the night, resumed its sway. Naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at the end of their task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig. One mounted to keep it in its place, and the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along the wall and bush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now, as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with greater haste, and the process, natural though it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. Macfarlane made some ill-favoured jest about the farmer's wife. Still their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Thetis. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside the farmed dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been achieved, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," said he, making a great effort, "for God's sake, let's have a light." Seemingly Macfarlane was affected in the same direction, for though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no further than the crossroad down to Auchendrane. The rain still poured, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and shed a wide circle of misty brightness round the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other, and the thing they had along with them. The rain had moulded the rough sacking to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modelled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time Macfarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swathed like a wet sheet above the body, and tightened the white skin upon the face of Thetis. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of what could not be, kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said Macfarlane in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Thetis. "Hold that lamp," said the other. "I must see her face." And as Thetis took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack, and drew down the cover from the head. The light fell very clear upon the dark, well-moulded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams of both of these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leapt from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished, and the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and went off towards Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it the sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Grey.
The Room in the Tower by E.F. Benson. It is probable that everybody who is at all a constant dreamer has had at least one experience of an event or a sequence of circumstances which have come to his mind in sleep being realized in the material world. But, in my opinion, so far from this being a strange thing, it would be far odder if this fulfillment did not occasionally happen, since our dreams are, as a rule, concerned with people whom we know, and places with which we are familiar, such as might very naturally occur in the awake and daylit world. True, these dreams are often broken into by some absurd and fantastic incident, which puts them out of court in regard to their subsequent fulfillment, but on the mere calculation of chances, it doesn't appear in the least unlikely that a dream imagined by anyone who dreams constantly should occasionally come true. Not long ago, for instance, I experienced such a fulfillment of a dream which seems to me in no way remarkable, and to have no kind of psychical significance. The manner of it was as follows. A certain friend of mine, living abroad, is amiable enough to write to me about once in a fortnight. Thus, when 14 days or thereabouts have elapsed since I last heard from him, my mind, probably either consciously or subconsciously, is expectant of a letter from him. One night last week I dreamt that, as I was going upstairs to dress for dinner, I heard, as I often heard, the sound of the postman's knock on my front door, and diverted my direction downstairs instead. There, among other correspondence, was a letter from him. Thereafter the fantastic entered, for on opening it I found inside the ace of diamonds, and scribbled across it in his well-known handwriting, "I am sending you this for safe custody, as you know it is running an unreasonable risk to keep aces in Italy." The next evening I was just preparing to go upstairs to dress when I heard the postman's knock, and did precisely as I had done in my dream. There, among other letters, was one from my friend, only it did not contain the ace of diamonds. Had it done so, I should have attached more weight to the matter, which, as it stands, seems to me a perfectly ordinary coincidence. No doubt I consciously or subconsciously expected a letter from him, and this suggested to me my dream. Similarly, the fact that my friend had not written to me for a fortnight suggested to him that he should do so. But occasionally it is not so easy to find such an explanation, and for the following story I can find no explanation at all. It came out of the dark, and into the dark it has gone again. All my life I have been a habitual dreamer. The nights are few, that is to say, when I do not find on awaking in the morning that some mental experience has been mine, and sometimes all night long apparently a series of the most dazzling adventures before me. It was when I was about 16 that a certain dream first came to me, and this is how it befell. It opened with my being set down at the door of a big red brick house, where I understood I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was going on in the garden, and led me through a low, dark-panelled hall with a large open fireplace onto a cheerful green lawn set round with flower-beds. There were grouped about the tea-table a small party of people, but they were all strangers to me, except one, who was a schoolfellow called Jack Stone, clearly the son of the house, and he introduced me to his mother and father and a couple of sisters. I was, I remember, somewhat astonished to find myself here, for the boy in question was scarcely known to me, and I rather disliked what I knew of him. Moreover, he had left school nearly a year before. The afternoon was very hot, and an intolerable oppression reigned. On the far side of the lawn ran a red brick wall with an iron gate in its centre, outside which stood a walnut tree. We sat in the shadow of the house opposite a row of long windows, inside which I could see a table with cloth laid, glimmering with glass and silver. This garden front of the house was very long, and at one end of it stood a tower of 3 stories, which looked to me much older than the rest of the building. Before long, Mrs. Stone, who, like the rest of the party, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Quite inexplicably, my heart sank at her words. I felt as if I had known that I should have the room in the tower, and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I had to follow him. In silence we passed through the hall and mounted a great oak staircase with many corners, and arrived at a small landing with 2 doors set in it. He pushed one of these open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closed it behind me. Then I knew that my conjecture had been right. There was something awful in the room, and with a terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I awoke in a spasm of terror. Now, that dream, or variations on it, occurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often it came in exactly this form: the arrival, the tea out on the lawn, the deadly silence, succeeded by that one deadly sentence, the mounting with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower where horror dwelt, and it always came to a close in the nightmare of terror at that which was in the room, though I never saw what it was. At other times I experienced variations on this same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be sitting at dinner in the dining-room, into the windows of which I had looked on the first night when the dream of this house visited me. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding. And the silence I knew would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Upon which, this was invariable, I had to follow him up the oak staircase with many corners, and enter the place that I dreaded more and more each time that I visited it in sleep. Or again I would find myself playing cards, still in silence, in a drawing-room lit with immense chandeliers that gave a blinding illumination. What the game was I have no idea, What I remember with a sense of miserable anticipation was that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." This drawing-room where we played cards was next to the dining-room, and, as I've said, was always brilliantly illuminated, whereas the rest of the house was full of dusk and shadows. And yet, how often, in spite of those bouquets of lights, have I not pored over the cards that were dealt to me, scarcely able for some reason to see them? Their designs, too, were strange. There were no red suits, but all were black, and among them there were certain cards which were black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I got to know the greater part of the house. There was a smoking-room beyond the drawing-room, at the end of a passage with a green baize door. It was always very dark there, and as often as I went there I passed somebody whom I could not see in the doorway, coming out. Curious developments, too, took place in the characters that peopled the dream, as might happen to living persons. Mrs. Stone, for instance, who, when I first saw her, had been black-haired, became grey, and instead of rising briskly, as she had done at first when she said, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower," got up very feebly, as if the strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew up, and became a rather ill-looking young man with a brown moustache, while one of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood she was married. Then it so happened that I was not visited by this dream for 6 months or more, and I began to hope, in such inexplicable dread did I hold it, that it had passed away for good. But one night after this interval I again found myself being shown out onto the lawn for tea, and Mrs. Stone was not there, while the others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leapt at the thought that perhaps this time I should not have to sleep in the room in the tower. And though we usually all sat in silence, on this occasion the sense of relief made me talk and laugh as I had never yet done. But even then matters were not altogether comfortable, for no one else spoke, but they all looked secretly at each other. And soon the foolish stream of my talk ran dry, and gradually an apprehension, worse than anything I had previously known, gained on me as the light slowly faded. Suddenly a voice which I knew well broke the stillness, the voice of Mrs. Stone, saying, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." It seemed to come from near the gate in the red brick wall that bounded the lawn, and looking up I saw that the grass outside was sown thick with gravestones. A curious greyish light shone from them, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me, and it was, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." And, as usual, Jack got up, and again I followed him through the hall and up the staircase with many corners. On this occasion it was darker than usual, and when I passed into the room in the tower I could only just see the furniture, the position of which was already familiar to me. Also there was a dreadful odour of decay in the room, and I woke screaming. The dream, with such variations and developments as I have mentioned, went on at intervals for 15 years. Sometimes I would dream it 2 or 3 nights in succession. Once, as I have said, there was an intermission of 6 months, but taking a reasonable average, I should say that I dreamt it quite as often as once in a month. It had, as is plain, something of nightmare about it, since it always ended in the same appalling terror, which, so far from getting less, seemed to me to gather fresh fear every time that I experienced it. There was, too, a strange and dreadful consistency about it. The characters in it, as I have mentioned, got regularly older. Death and marriage visited this silent family, and I never in the dream, after Mrs. Stone had died, set eyes on her again. But it was always her voice that told me that the room in the tower was prepared for me, and whether we had tea out on the lawn, or the scene was laid in one of the rooms overlooking it, I could always see her gravestone standing just outside the iron gate. It was the same, too, with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned again in company with a man whom I took to be her husband. He, too, like the rest of them, was always silent. But owing to the constant repetition of the dream, I had ceased to attach, in my waking hours, any significance to it. I had never met Jack Stone again during all those years, nor did I ever see a house that resembled this dark house of my dream. And then something happened. I'd been in London in this year up till the end of July, and during the first week in August went down to stay with a friend in a house he had taken for the summer months in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. I left London early, for John Clinton was to meet me at Forest Row Station, and we were going to spend the day golfing and go to his house in the evening. He had his motor with him, and we set off about 5 in the afternoon after a thoroughly delightful day for the drive, the distance being some 10 miles. As it was still so early, we did not have tea at the clubhouse, but waited till we should get home. As we drove, the weather, which up till then had been, though hot, deliciously fresh, seemed to me to alter in quality, and become very stagnant and oppressive, and I felt that indefinable sense of ominous apprehension that I am accustomed to before thunder. Our way lay through deep, high-banked lanes, and before we'd gone very far I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the stopping of the motor. And with a sudden thrill, partly of fear but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of my house of dream. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was dreaming still, through a low oak-panelled hall, and out onto the lawn, where tea was laid in the shadow of the house. It was set in flower beds, a red brick wall, with a gate in it, bounded one side, and out beyond that was a space of rough grass with a walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-storey tower, markedly older than the rest. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the repeated dreams ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful persons, all of whom were known to me. And in spite of the horror with which the dream itself had always filled me, I felt nothing of it now that the scene of it was thus reproduced before me, but I felt the intensest curiosity as to what was going to happen. Tea pursued its cheerful course, and before long Mrs. Clinton got up. At that moment I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." At that, for half a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and again I felt nothing more than the most intense curiosity. It was not very long before it was amply satisfied. John turned to me. "Right up at the top of the house," he said, "but I think you'll be comfortable. We're absolutely full up. Would you like to go and see it now? By Jove, I believe that we're going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it's become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall, and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door, and I went in. And at that moment sheer, unreasoning terror again possessed me. I did not know for certain what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection, when one remembers a name which has long escaped the memory, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave with the sinister inscription in evil memory I had so often seen in my dream just beyond the lawn which lay below my window. And then, once more, the fear passed so completely that I wondered what there was to fear, and I found myself sober and quiet and sane in the room in the tower, the name of which I had so often heard in my dream, and the scene of which was so familiar. I looked round it with a certain sense of proprietorship, and found that nothing had been changed from the dreaming nights in which I knew it so well. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall, with the head of it in the angle. In a line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door, the outer wall was pierced by 2 lattice-paned windows, between which stood the dressing-table, while ranged along the fourth wall was the washing-stand and a big cupboard. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were 2 rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone, the other a black-and-white sketch of Jack Stone, representing him as he had appeared to me only a week before in the last of the series of these repeated dreams, a rather secret and evil-looking man of about 30. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room to the other portrait, which hung at the side of the bed. At that I looked next, and as I looked I felt once more the horror of nightmare seize me. It represented Mrs. Stone as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of the evident feebleness of body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign. The whole face was distinct with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands, clasped together on the knee, seemed shaking with suppressed and nameless glee. Then I saw also that it was signed in the left-hand bottom corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely and read the inscription, Julia Stone, by Julia Stone. There came a tap at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," said I, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard-featured old lady," he said. "By herself, too, I remember. Anyhow, she can't have flattered herself much." "Don't you see," said I, "it's scarcely a human face at all. It's the face of some witch, of some devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes. It isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? Ha! Yes, I can imagine getting a nightmare if I went to sleep with that close by my bed. I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing and put it with its face to the wall. Joe, the old lady's a weight," said John, mopping his forehead. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me, too. I was about to reply when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it, in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," said I. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it. I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower room and washed the blood off. But neither on his hand nor on mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or cut. It seemed to me that, having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again. Something in my case had dimly occurred to me that I did not wish to think about. It was but a conjecture, but I fancied that I knew the same thing had occurred to him. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn, where we had had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and no twinkle of star or moon ray could penetrate the pall of cloud that overset the sky. By degrees our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, men dispersed to the smoking or billiard room, and by 11 o'clock my host and I were the only two left. All the evening I thought that he had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone he spoke. "The man who helped us with the picture had blood on his hand too, did you notice?" he said. "I asked him just now if he'd cut himself, and he said he supposed he had, but that he could find no mark of it. Now, where did that blood come from?" By dint of telling myself that I was not going to think about it, I had succeeded in not doing so, and I did not want, especially just at bedtime, to be reminded of it. "I don't know," said I, "and I don't really care so long as the picture of Mrs. Julia Stone is not by my bed." He got up. "But it's odd," he said. "Ha! Now you'll see another odd thing." A dog of his, an Irish terrier, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to the iron gate which led onto the rough grass outside, where the walnut tree stood. I saw that the dog had all his hackles up, bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth, as if he was ready to spring at something, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or me, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars and still growling. Then, of a sudden, his courage seemed to desert him. He gave one long howl, and scuttled back to the house with a curious crouching sort of movement. "Yeah, he does that half a dozen times a day," said John. "He sees something which he both hates and fears." I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass outside, and soon a sound which I could not instantly identify came to my ears. Then I remembered what it was. It was the purring of a cat. I lit a match and saw the purrer, a big blue Persian, walking round and round in a little circle just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically, with tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed the grass. I laughed. "The end of that mystery, I'm afraid," I said. "Here's a large cat having Walpurgis night all alone." "Oh, yes, that's Darius," said John. "He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery, for Toby and he are the best of friends, but the beginning of the cat mystery. What's the cat doing there? And why is Darius pleased while Toby is terror-stricken?" At that moment I remembered the rather horrible details of my dreams when I saw through the gate, just where the cat was now, the white tombstone with the sinister inscription. But before I could answer, the rain began, and simultaneously the big cat squeezed through the bars of the gate and came leaping across the lawn. Then it sat in the doorway, looking out eagerly into the dark. Somehow, with the portrait of Julius Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me, and as I went to bed, feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than interest for the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the cat and dog. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was the square, empty space by my bed where the portrait had been. Here the paper was of its original full tint of dark red. Over the rest of the walls it had faded. Then I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awakening was equally instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed, under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after, a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something I knew was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away, and my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leapt out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leant over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mould, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased, and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me, and more horrible yet, perceived an odour of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye, by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I've been long waiting for you. At last you've come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." And the quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which I think had paralyzed me for the moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping over whatever it was that lay there, and by the merest good luck found the handle of the door. Almost at the same moment I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running upstairs. "Oh, what is it?" he said. "I sleep just below you and heard a noise as if— Oh, good heavens! There's blood on your shoulder!" I stood there, so he told me afterwards, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with a mark on my shoulder as if a hand covered with blood had been laid there.
"It's in there," I said, pointing. "She. You know, the portrait is in there too, hanging up on the place we took it from." "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare," he said. He pushed by me and opened the door, I standing there simply inert with terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. "Phew, an awful smell," he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the open door. Next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. "Yes, the portrait's there," he said. "And on the floor is a thing. There's a thing spotted with earth, like what they bury people in. Come away, quick, come away." How I got downstairs I hardly know. An awful shuddering and nausea of the spirit rather than of the flesh had seized me, and more than once he had to place my feet upon the steps, while every now and then he cast glances of terror and apprehension up the stairs. But in time we came to his dressing-room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have here described. The sequel can be made short. Indeed, some may have perhaps already guessed what it was, if they remember that inexplicable affair of the churchyard at West Fawley, some 8 years ago, where an attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion the coffin was found in the course of a few days, again protruding from the ground. After a 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. Where it was buried was just outside the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Subsequently, the body was again secretly dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood.
The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, than, impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed further westward to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile nor speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and directly opposite a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been sunning himself on his doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window. But I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock.
He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white. His face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day, Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told and should remember. I know only that, with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstances that many years afterwards, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost which every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter, that supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin, and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubts, but God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life. For what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health, but at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness, and so passed away, apparently with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, "I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her, when she is no longer in sight. But now, she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right, somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem." He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an under-sense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later, and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low, grave notes that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life. To another, as the blow of a bludgeon, which, in crushing, benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet, and unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the open window a long, wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening wood. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast, perhaps it was a dream, for Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterwards appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke, and, lifting his head from his arms, intently listened, he knew not why. There, in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see he knew not what. His senses were all alert. His breath was suspended. His blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what, had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly, the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step. Another. Sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness, through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him, and at the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, with a little groping seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther, dragging the dead woman towards the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there was darkness, blacker than before, and silence. And when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high, and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood, not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear.
The Waxwork by A.M. Burridge. While the uniformed attendants of Mariner's Waxworks were ushering the last stragglers through the great glass-panelled double doors, the manager sat in his office interviewing Raymond Hewson. The manager was a youngish man, stout, blond, and of medium height. He wore his clothes well, and contrived to look extremely smart without appearing overdressed. Raymond Hewson looked neither. His clothes, which had been good when new, and which were still carefully brushed and pressed, were beginning to show signs of their owner's losing battle with the world. He was a small, spare, pale man, with lank, errant brown hair, and although he spoke plausibly and even forcibly, he had the defensive and somewhat furtive air of a man who was used to rebuffs. He looked what he was, a man gifted somewhat above the ordinary, who was a failure through his lack of self-assertion. The manager was speaking. "There's nothing new in your request," he said. "In fact, we refuse it to different people, mostly young bloods who have tried to make bets, about 3 times a week. We have nothing to gain, and something to lose by letting people spend the night in our murderer's den. If I allowed it, and some young idiot lost his senses, what would be my position? But your being a journalist somewhat alters the case." Hewson smiled. "I suppose you mean that journalists have no senses to lose?" "No," laughed the manager, "but one imagines them to be responsible people. Besides, here we have something to gain, publicity and advertisement." "Exactly," said Hewson. "And there I thought we might come to terms." The manager laughed again. "Oh," he exclaimed, "I know what's coming. You want to be paid twice, do you? It used to be said years ago that Madame Tussauds would give a man £100 for sleeping alone in the Chamber of Horrors. I hope you don't think that we have made any such offer." What is your paper, Mr. Hewson?" "I'm freelancing at present," Hewson confessed. "Working on space for several papers. However, I should find no difficulty in getting the story printed. The Morning Echo would use it like a shot. A night with Mariner's murderers. No live paper could turn it down." The manager rubbed his chin. "Ah. And how do you propose to treat it?" "Well, I shall make it gruesome, of course. Gruesome with just a saving touch of humour." The other nodded and offered Hewson his cigarette case. "Very well, Mr. Hewson," he said. "Get your story printed in the Morning Echo, and there will be a £5 note waiting for you here when you care to come and call for it. But first of all, it's no small ordeal that you're proposing to undertake. I'd like to be quite sure about you, and I'd like you to be quite sure about yourself. I own I shouldn't care to take it on. I've seen those figures, dressed and undressed. I know all about the process of their manufacture. I can walk about in company downstairs as unmoved as if I were walking among so many skittles. But I should hate having to sleep down there alone among them." "Why?" asked Hewson. "Oh, I don't know. There isn't any reason. I don't believe in ghosts. If I did, I should expect them to haunt the scene of their crimes, or the spot where their bodies were laid, instead of a cellar which happens to contain their waxwork effigies. It's just that I couldn't sit alone among them all night, with their seeming to stare at me in the way they do. After all, they represent the lowest and most appalling types of humanity, and, although I wouldn't own it publicly, the people who come to see them are not generally charged with the very highest motives. The whole atmosphere of the place is unpleasant, and if you're susceptible to atmosphere, I warn you that you're in for a very uncomfortable night." Hewson had known that from the moment when the idea had first occurred to him. His soul sickened at the prospect, even while he smiled casually upon the manager. But he had a wife and family to keep, and for the past month he had been living on paragraphs, eked out by his rapidly dwindling store of savings. Here was a chance not to be missed, the price of a special story in the Morning Echo, with a £5 note to add to it. It meant comparative wealth and luxury for a week, and freedom from the worst anxieties for a fortnight. Besides, if he wrote the story well, it might lead to an offer of regular employment. "The way of transgressors, and newspaper men, is hard," he said. "I've already promised myself an uncomfortable night because your murderer's den is obviously not fitted up as a hotel bedroom.
But I don't think your waxworks will worry me much. You're not superstitious? Not a bit, Hewson laughed. But you're a journalist. You must have a strong imagination. The news editors for whom I've worked have always complained that I haven't any. Plain facts are not considered sufficient in our trade, and the papers don't like offering their readers unbuttered bread. The manager smiled and rose. Right, he said. I think the last of the people have gone. Wait a moment. I'll give orders for the figures downstairs not to be draped, and let the night people know that you'll be here. Then I'll take you down and show you around. He picked up the receiver of a house telephone, spoke into it, and presently replaced it. One condition I'm afraid I must impose on you, he remarked. I must ask you not to smoke. We had a fire scare down in the murderer's den this evening. I don't know who gave the alarm, but whoever it was a false one. Fortunately, there were very few people down there at the time, or there might have been a panic. And now, if you're ready, we'll make a move. Hewson followed the manager through half a dozen rooms where attendants were busy shrouding kings and queens of England, the generals and prominent statesmen of this and other generations, all the mixed herd of humanity whose fame or notoriety had rendered them eligible for this kind of immortality. The manager stopped once and spoke to a man in uniform, saying something about an armchair in the murderer's den. It's the best we can do for you, I'm afraid, he said to Hewson. I hope you'll be able to get some sleep. He led the way through an open barrier and down ill-lit stone stairs which conveyed a sinister impression of giving access to a dungeon. In a passage at the bottom were a few preliminary horrors, such as relics of the Inquisition, a rack taken from a medieval castle, branding irons, thumbscrews, and other mementos of man's one-time cruelty to man. Beyond the passage was the murderer's den. It was a room of irregular shape, with a vaulted roof and dimly lit by electric lights burning behind inverted bowls of frosted glass. It was, by design, an eerie and uncomfortable chamber, a chamber whose atmosphere invited its visitors to speak in whispers. There was something of the air of a chapel about it, but a chapel no longer devoted to the practice of piety, and given over now for base and impious worship. The waxwork murderers stood on low pedestals with numbered tickets at their feet. Seeing them elsewhere, and without knowing whom they represented, one would have thought them a dull-looking crew, chiefly remarkable for the shabbiness of their clothes. Recent notorieties rubbed dusty shoulders with old favourites. Thurtell, the murderer of Weir, stood as if frozen in the act of making a shop-window gesture to young Bywaters. There was Lefroy, the poor half-baked little snob who killed for gain so that he might ape the gentleman. Charles Peace, the only member of that vile company who looked uncompromisingly and entirely evil, sneered across a gangway at Norman Thorne. The manager, walking round with Hewson, pointed out several of the more interesting of these unholy notabilities. That's Crippen. Expect you recognize him? Insignificant little beast who looks as if he couldn't tread on a worm. And that's, Armstrong? Looks like a decent, harmless country gentleman, doesn't he? There's old Vakir. You can't miss him because of his beard. And, of course, this. Who's that? Hewson interrupted in a whisper, pointing. Oh, I was coming to him, said the manager in a light undertone. Yes, come and have a good look at him. This is our star turn. He's the only one of the bunch that hasn't been hanged. The figure which Hewson had indicated was that of a small, slight man, not much more than 5 feet in height. It wore little waxed moustaches, large spectacles, and a caped coat. There was something so exaggeratedly French in its appearance that it reminded Hewson of a stage caricature. He could not have said precisely why the mild-looking face seemed to him so repellent, but he had already recoiled a step, and even in the manager's company it cost him an effort to look again. Who is he? He asked. That, said the manager, is Dr. Bourdet. Hewson shook his head doubtfully. I think I've heard the name, he said. But I forget in connection with what? The manager smiled. Oh, you'd remember better if you were a Frenchman, he said. For some long while that man was the terror of Paris. He carried on his work of healing by day, and of throat-cutting by night when the fit was on him. Oh, he killed for the sheer devilish pleasure it gave him to kill, and always in the same way, with a razor. After his last crime, he left a clue behind him which set the police upon his track. One clue led to another, Before very long they knew that they were on the track of the Parisian equivalent of our Jack the Ripper, and had enough evidence to send him to the madhouse or the guillotine on a dozen capital charges. But even then our friend was too clever for them. When he realized that the toils were closing about him, he mysteriously disappeared. And ever since, the police of every civilized country have been looking for him. Well, there's no doubt that he managed to make away with himself, and by some means which has prevented his body coming to light. 1 or 2 crimes of a similar nature have taken place since his disappearance, but he is believed almost for certain to be dead. It's queer, isn't it, how every notorious murderer has imitators? Hewson shuddered and fidgeted with his feet. Don't like him at all, he confessed. What eyes he's got. Yes, this figure's a little masterpiece. You find the eyes bite into you? Well, that's excellent realism, then, for Baudet practised mesmerism, and was supposed to mesmerize his victims before dispatching them. Indeed, had he not done so, it's impossible to see how so small a man could have done his ghastly work. There were never any signs of a struggle. I thought I saw him move, said Hewson with a catch in his voice. The manager smiled. You'll have more than one optical illusion before the night's out, I expect. You shan't be locked in. You can come upstairs when you've had enough of it. There are watchmen on the premises, so you'll find company. Don't be alarmed if you hear them moving about. I'm sorry I can't give you any more light, because all the lights are on, and for obvious reasons we keep this place as gloomy as possible. The member of the night staff who placed the armchair for Hewson was inclined to be facetious. "Where will you have it, sir?" he asked, grinning. "Just here, so as you can have a little talk with Crippen when you're tired of sitting still?" "Say where, sir?" Hewson smiled. The man's chaff pleased him, if only because, for the moment at least, it lent the proceedings a much-desired air of the commonplace. "I'll place it myself, thanks," he said. "I'll find out where the drafts come from first." "Phew, you won't find any down here. Well, good night, sir. I'm upstairs if you want me. Don't let them sneak up behind you and touch your neck with their cold and clammy hands." Hewson laughed and wished the man good night. It was easier than he had expected. He wheeled the armchair, a heavy one upholstered in plush, a little way down the central gangway, and deliberately turned it so that its back was towards the effigy of Dr. Baudet. For some undefined reason, he liked Dr. Baudet a great deal less than his companions. Busying himself with arranging the chair, he was almost light-hearted, but when the attendant's footfalls had died away and a deep hush stole over the chamber, he realized that he had no slight ordeal before him. The dim, unwavering light fell on the rows of figures, which were so uncannily like human beings that a silence and the stillness seemed unnatural and even ghastly. He missed the sound of breathing, the rustling of clothes, the 101 minute noises one hears when even the deepest silence has fallen upon a crowd. But the air was as stagnant as water at the bottom of a standing pond. There was not a breath in the chamber to stir a curtain or rustle a hanging drapery or start a shadow. His own shadow, moving in response to a shifted arm or leg, was all that could be coaxed into motion. All was still to the gaze and silent to the ear. It must be like this at the bottom of the sea, he thought, and wondered how to work the phrase into his story on the morrow. He faced the sinister figures boldly enough. They were only waxworks. So long as he let that thought dominate all others, he promised himself that all would be well. It did not, however, save him long from the discomfort occasioned by the waxen stare of Dr. Baudet, which he knew was directed upon him from behind. The eyes of the little Frenchman's effigy haunted and tormented him, and he itched with the desire to turn and look. "Come," he thought, "my nerves are started already. If I turn and look at that dressed-up dummy, it will be an admission of funk." And then another voice in his brain spoke to him. "It's because you're afraid that you won't turn and look at him." The two voices quarrelled silently for a moment or two, and at last Hewson slewed his chair round a little and looked behind him. Among the many figures standing in stiff, unnatural poses, the effigy of the dreadful little doctor stood out with a queer prominence, perhaps because a steady beam of light beat straight down upon it. Hewson flinched before the parody of mildness which some fiendishly skilled craftsman had managed to convey in wax, met the eyes for one agonized second, and turned again to face the other direction. "He's only a waxwork like the rest of you," Hewson muttered defiantly. "They're all only waxworks." They were only waxworks, yes, but waxworks don't move. Not that he had seen the least movement anywhere, but it struck him that in the moment or two while he had looked behind him, there had been the least subtle change in the grouping of the figures in front. Crippen, for instance, seemed to have turned at least 1 degree to the left. Or, thought Hewson, perhaps the illusion was due to the fact that he had not slewed his chair back into its exact original position. Hewson held his breath for a moment, and then drew his courage back to him as a man lifts a weight. He remembered the words of more than one news editor and laughed savagely to himself. "They tell me I've got no imagination," he said beneath his breath. He took a notebook from his pocket and wrote quickly. Mem. Deathly silence and unearthly stillness of figures, like being bottom of sea. Hypnotic eyes of Dr. Bourdette. Figures seem to move when not being watched. He closed the book suddenly over his fingers and looked round quickly and awfully over his right shoulder. He had neither seen nor heard a movement, but it was as if some sixth sense had made him aware of one. He looked straight into the vapid countenance of Lefroy, which smiled back as if to say, "It wasn't I." Of course it wasn't he, or any of them. It was his own nerves. Or was it? Hadn't Crippen moved again during that moment when his attention was directed elsewhere? You couldn't trust that little man. Once you took your eyes off him, he took advantage of it to shift his position. That was what they were all doing, if he only knew it, he told himself, and half rose out of his chair. This was not quite good enough. He was going. He wasn't going to spend the night with a lot of waxworks which moved while he wasn't looking. Hewson sat down again. This was very cowardly and very absurd. They were only waxworks, and they couldn't move. Let him hold that thought, and all would yet be well. Then why all that silent unrest about him? A subtle something in the air, which did not quite break the silence, and happened whichever way he looked, just beyond the boundaries of his vision. He swung round quickly to encounter the mild but baleful stare of Dr. Bourdette. Then, without warning, he jerked his head back to stare straight at Crippen. Ha! He'd nearly caught Crippen that time. "You'd better be careful, Crippen, and all the rest of you. If I do see one of you move, I'll smash you to pieces. Do you hear that?" He ought to go, he told himself. Already he had experienced enough to write his story, or 10 stories for that matter. Well, then, why not go? The Morning Echo would be none the wiser as to how long he had stayed, nor would it care so long as his story was a good one. Yes, but that night watchman upstairs would chaff him. And the manager, one never knew, perhaps the manager would quibble over that £5 note which he needed so badly. He wondered if Rose were asleep, or if she were lying awake and thinking of him. She'd laugh when he told her that he had imagined... This was a little too much. It was bad enough that the waxwork effigies of murderers should move when they weren't being watched, but it was intolerable that they should breathe. Somebody was breathing. Or was it his own breath, which sounded to him as if it came from a distance? He sat rigid, listening and straining, until he exhaled with a long sigh. His own breath, after all. Or if not, something had divined that he was listening and had ceased breathing simultaneously. Hewson jerked his head swiftly round and looked all about him out of haggard and hunted eyes. Everywhere his gaze encountered the vacant, waxen faces, and everywhere he felt that by just some least fraction of a second he had missed seeing a movement of hand or foot, a silent opening or compression of lips, a flicker of eyelids, a look of human intelligence now smoothed out. They were like naughty children in a class, whispering, fidgeting, and laughing behind their teacher's back, but blandly innocent when his gaze was turned upon them. Oh, this would not do. This distinctly would not do. He must clutch at something, grip with his mind upon something which belonged essentially to the workaday world, to the daylight London streets. He was Raymond Hewson, a living and breathing man, and these figures grouped around him were only dummies, so they could neither move nor whisper. What did it matter if they were supposed to be lifelike effigies of murderers? They were only made of wax and sawdust, and stood there for the entertainment of morbid sightseers and orange-sucking trippers. Oh, that was better. Now, What was that funny story which somebody had told him yesterday? He recalled part of it, but not all, for the gaze of Dr. Baudet urged, challenged, and finally compelled him to turn. Hewson half-turned, and then swung his chair so as to bring him face to face with the wearer of those dreadful hypnotic eyes. His own eyes were dilated, and his mouth, at first set in a grin of terror, lifted at the corners in a snarl. Then Hewson spoke and woke 100 sinister echoes. "You moved, blast you!" he cried. "Yes, you did, blast you! I saw you!" Then he sat quite still, staring straight before him, like a man found frozen in the Arctic snows. Dr. Baudet's movements were leisurely. He stepped off his pedestal with the mincing care of a lady alighting from a bus. A platform stood about 2 feet from the ground, and above the edge of it a plush-covered rope hung in arc-like curves. Dr. Baudet lifted up the rope until it formed an arch for him to pass under, stepped off the platform, and sat down on the edge facing Hewson. Then he nodded and smiled and said, "Good evening. I need hardly tell you," he continued in perfect English, in which was traceable only the least foreign accent, "that not until I overheard the conversation between you and the worthy manager of this establishment did I suspect that I should have the pleasure of a companion here for the night. You cannot move or speak without my bidding, but you can hear me perfectly well. Something tells me that you are, shall I say, nervous? My dear sir, have no illusions. I am not one of these contemptible effigies miraculously come to life. I am Dr. Baudet himself." He paused, coughed, and shifted his legs. "Oh, pardon me," he resumed, "but I am a little stiff. And let me explain. Circumstances with which I need not fatigue you have made it desirable that I should live in England. I was close to this building this evening when I saw a policeman regarding me a thought too curiously. I guessed that he intended to follow, and perhaps ask me embarrassing questions. So I mingled with the crowd and came in here. An extra coin bought my admission to the chamber in which we now meet, and an inspiration showed me a certain means of escape. I raised a cry of fire, and when all the fools had rushed to the stairs, I stripped my effigy of the caped coat which you behold me wearing, donned it, hid my effigy under the platform at the back, and took its place on the pedestal. I own that I have since spent a very fatiguing evening, but fortunately I was not always being watched, and had opportunities to draw an occasional deep breath and ease the rigidity of my pose. One small boy screamed and exclaimed that he saw me moving. I understand that he was to be whipped and put straight to bed on his return home. The manager's description of me, which I had the embarrassment of being compelled to overhear, was biased, but not altogether inaccurate. Clearly, I am not dead, although it is well that the world thinks otherwise. His account of my hobby, which I indulged for years, was in the main true, although not intelligently expressed. The world is divided between collectors and non-collectors. With the non-collectors we are not concerned. The collectors collect anything, according to their individual tastes, from money to cigarette cards, from moths to matchboxes. I collect throats." He paused again, and regarded Hewson's throat with interest mingled with disfavour. "I am obliged to the chance which brought us together tonight," he continued, "and perhaps it would seem ungrateful to complain. From motives of personal safety, my activities have been somewhat curtailed of late years, and I am glad of this opportunity of gratifying my somewhat unusual whim. But you have a skinny neck, sir, if you will overlook a personal remark. I should never have selected you from choice. I like men with thick necks, thick red necks." He fumbled in an inside pocket and took out something which he tested against a wet forefinger, and then proceeded to pass gently to and fro across the palm of his left hand. "This is a little French razor," he remarked blandly. "They're not much used in England, but perhaps you know them? One strops them on wood. The blade, you will observe, is very narrow.
They do not cut very deep, but deep enough. In just one little moment you shall see for yourself. I shall ask you the little civil question of all polite barbers. Does the razor suit you, sir? He rose up, a diminutive but menacing figure of evil, and approached Hewson with the silent, furtive step of a hunting panther. "You will have the goodness," he said, "to raise your chin a little. Thank you. And a little more. Just a little more. Ah, thank you. Merci, monsieur. Ah, merci. Merci." Over one end of the chamber was a thick skylight of frosted glass, which by day let in a few sickly and filtered rays from the floor above. After sunrise, these began to mingle with the subdued light from the electric bulbs, and this mingled illumination added a certain ghastliness to a scene which needed no additional touch of horror. The waxwork figures stood apathetically in their places, waiting to be admired or execrated by the crowds who would presently wander fearfully among them. In their midst, Hewson sat still, leaning far back in his armchair. His chin was up-tilted, as if he were waiting to receive attention from a barber, and although there was not a scratch upon his throat, nor anywhere upon his body, he was cold and dead. His previous employers were wrong in having credited him with no imagination. Dr. Baudet, on his pedestal, watched the dead man unemotionally. He did not move, nor was he capable of motion. But then, after all, he was only a waxwork.
Moonlight Sonata by Alexander Woolcott. If this report were to be published in its own England, I would have to cross my fingers on the little foreword, explaining that all the characters were fictitious, which stern requirement of the British libel law would embarrass me slightly, because none of the characters is fictitious, and the story, told to Catherine Cornell by Clements Dane and by Catherine Cornell told to me, chronicles what, to the best of my knowledge and belief, actually befell a young English physician, whom I shall call Alban Barach, because that does not happen to be his name. It is an account of a hitherto unreported adventure he had 2 years ago, when he went down into Kent to visit an old friend, let us call him Ellery Cazalet, who spent most of his days on the links, and most of his nights, wondering how he would ever pay the death duties on the collapsing family manor house, to which he had indignantly fallen heir. This house was a shabby little cousin to Compton Wynyates, with roof tiles of Tudor red making it cosy in the noonday sun, and a hoarse hell which, from the clock tower, had been contemptuously scattering the hours like coins ever since Henry VIII was a rosy stripling. Within, Cazalet could afford only a doddering couple to fend for him, and the once sumptuous gardens did much as they pleased, under the care of a single gardener. I think I must risk giving the gardener's real name, for none I could invent would have so appropriate a flavour. It was John Scripture, and he was assisted, from time to time, by an aged and lunatic father, who, in his lucid intervals, would be let out from his captivity under the eaves of the lodge, to putter amid the lewd topiarian extravagance of the hedges. The doctor was to come down when he could, with a promise of some good golf, long nights of exquisite silence, and a ghost or two thrown in if his fancy ran that way. It was characteristic of his rather ponderous humour that, in writing to fix a day, he addressed Cazalet at the Creeps, Sevenoaks, Kent. When he arrived, it was to find his host away from home and not due back until all hours. Barach was to dine alone with a reproachful setter for a companion, and not wait up. His bedroom on the ground floor was beautifully panelled from footboard to ceiling, but some misguided housekeeper, under the 4th George, had fallen upon the lovely woodwork with a can of black varnish. The dowry, brought by a Cazalet bride of the Mauve decade, had been invested in a few vintage bathrooms, and one of these had replaced a prayer closet that once opened into this bedroom. There was only a candle to read by, but the light of a full moon came waveringly through the wind-stirred vines that half-curtained the mullioned windows. In this museum, Baruch dropped off to sleep. He did not know how long he had slept when he found himself awake again, and conscious that something was astir in the room. It took him a moment to place the movement, but at last, in a patch of moonlight, he made out a hunched figure that seemed to be sitting with bent, engrossed head in the chair by the door. It was the hand, or rather the whole arm, that was moving, tracing a recurrent, if irregular, course in the air. At first the gesture was teasingly half-familiar, and then Baruch recognized it as the one a woman makes when embroidering. There would be a hesitation, as if the needle were being thrust through some taut, resistant material, and then, each time, the long, swift, sure pull of the thread. To the startled guest, this seemed the least menacing activity he had ever heard ascribed to a ghost. But just the same, he had only one idea, and that was to get out of that room with all possible dispatch. His mind made a hasty reconnaissance. The door into the hall was out of the question, for madness lay that way. At least he would have to pass right by that weaving arm, nor did he relish a blind plunge into the thorny shrubbery beneath his window, and a barefoot scamper across the frosty turf. Of course there was the bathroom, but that was small comfort if he could not get out of it by another door. In a spasm of concentration, he remembered that he had seen another door. Just at the moment of this realization, he heard the comfortingly actual sound of a car coming up the drive, and guessed that it was his host returning. In one magnificent movement, he leapt to the floor, bounded into the bathroom, and bolted its door behind him. The floor of the room beyond was quilted with moonlight. Wading through that, he arrived, breathless but unmolested, in the corridor. Further along he could see the lamp left burning in the entrance hall, and hear the clatter of his host closing the front door. As Baruch came hurrying out of the darkness to greet him, Cazalet boomed his delight at such affability, and, famished by his long, cold ride, proposed an immediate raid on the larder. The doctor, already sheepish at his recent panic, said nothing about it, and was all for food at once. With lighted candles held high, the foraging party descended on the offices, and mine host was descanting on the merits of cold roast beef, cheddar cheese, and milk as a light midnight snack, when he stumbled over a bundle on the floor. With a cheerful curse at the old goody of the kitchen, who was always leaving something about, he bent to see what it was this time, and let out a whistle of surprise. Then, by two candles held low, he and the doctor saw something they will not forget while they live. It was the body of the cook. Just the body. The head was gone. On the floor alongside lay a bloody cleaver. "Old Scripture, by God!" Cazalet cried out, and, in a flash, Baruch guessed. Still clutching a candle in one hand, he dragged his companion back through the interminable house to the room from which he had fled, motioning him to be silent, tiptoeing the final steps. That precaution was wasted, for a regiment could not have disturbed the rapt contentment of the ceremony still in progress within. The old lunatic had not left his seat by the door. Between his knees he still held the head of the woman he had killed. Scrupulously, happily crooning at his work, he was plucking out the grey hairs one by one.
The Easter Egg by Saki. It was distinctly hard lines for Lady Barbara, who came of good fighting stock, and was one of the bravest women of her generation, that her son should be so undisguisedly a coward. Whatever good qualities Lester Slagby may have possessed, and he was, in some respects, charming, courage could certainly never be imputed to him. As a child he had suffered from childish timidity, as a boy from unboyish funk, and as a youth he had exchanged unreasoning fears for others which were more formidable from the fact of having a carefully thought-out basis. He was frankly afraid of animals, nervous with firearms, and never crossed the Channel without mentally comparing the numerical proportion of lifebelts to passengers. Lady Barbara no longer pretended not to see her son's prevailing weakness. With her usual courage, she faced the knowledge of it squarely, and, mother-like, loved him none the less. Continental travel, anywhere away from the great tourist tracks, was a favoured hobby with Lady Barbara, and Leicester joined her as often as possible. Eastertide usually found her at Knobaltheim, an upland township in one of those small princedoms that make inconspicuous freckles on the map of Central Europe. A long-standing acquaintanceship with the reigning family made her a personage of due importance in the eyes of her old friend the burgomaster, and she was anxiously consulted by that worthy on the momentous occasion when the prince made known his intention of coming in person to open a sanatorium outside the town. All the usual items in a programme of welcome, some of them fatuous and commonplace, others quaint and charming, had been arranged for. But the burgomaster hoped that the resourceful English lady might have something new and tasteful to suggest in the way of loyal greeting. The prince was known to the outside world, if at all, as an old-fashioned reactionary, combating modern progress, as it were, with a wooden sword. To his own people he was known as a kindly old gentleman, with a certain endearing stateliness which had nothing of standoffishness about it. Knobaltheim was anxious to do its best. Lady Barbara discussed the matter with Leicester and one or two acquaintances in her little hotel, but ideas were difficult to come by. "Might I suggest something for the gnädige Frau?" asked a sallow, high-cheek-boned lady, to whom the Englishwoman had spoken once or twice, and whom she had set down in her mind as probably a southern Slav. "Might I suggest something for the reception first?" she went on with a certain shy eagerness. "Our little child here, our baby, we will dress him in a little white coat with small wings as an Easter angel, and he will carry a large white Easter egg, and inside shall be a basket of plover eggs, of which the prince is so fond, and he shall give it to his Highness as Easter offering. It is so pretty an idea. We have seen it done once in Syria." Lady Barbara looked dubiously at the proposed Easter angel, a fair, wooden-faced child of about 4 years old. She had noticed it the day before in the hotel, and wondered rather how such a tow-headed child could belong to such a dark-visaged couple as the woman and her husband. Probably, she thought, an adopted baby, especially as the couple were not young. "Of course, gnädige Frau will escort the little child up to the prince," pursued the woman, "but he will be quite good, and do as he is told." "We have some plover's eggs shall come fresh from Wien," said the husband. The small child and Lady Barbara seemed equally unenthusiastic about the pretty idea. Leicester was openly discouraging, but when the burgomaster heard of it, he was enchanted. The combination of sentiment and plover's eggs appealed strongly to his Teutonic mind. On the eventful day, the Easter angel, really quite prettily and quaintly dressed, was a centre of kindly interest to the gala crowd marshalled to receive his Highness. The mother was unobtrusive and less fussy than most parents would have been under the circumstances, merely stipulating that she should place the Easter egg herself in the arms that had been carefully schooled how to hold the precious burden. Then Lady Barbara moved forward, the child marching stolidly and with grim determination at her side. It had been promised cakes and sweeties galore if it gave the egg well and truly to the kind old gentleman who was waiting to receive it. Leicester had tried to convey to it privately that horrible smackings would attend any failure in its share of the proceedings, but it is doubtful if his German caused more than an immediate distress. Lady Barbara had thoughtfully provided herself with an emergency supply of chocolate sweetmeats. Children may sometimes be time-servers, but they do not encourage long accounts. As they approached nearer to the princely dais, Lady Barbara stood discreetly aside, and the stolid-faced infant walked forward alone with staggering but steadfast gait, encouraged by a murmur of elderly approval. Lester, standing in the front row of the onlookers, turned to scan the crowd for the beaming faces of the happy parents. In a side road, which led to the railway station, he saw a cab. Entering the cab with every appearance of furtive haste were the dark-visaged couple who had been so plausibly eager for the pretty idea. The sharpened instinct of cowardice lit up the situation in one swift flash. The blood roared and surged to his head, as though thousands of floodgates had been opened in his veins, and his brain was the common sluice. He saw nothing but a blur around him. Then the blood ebbed away in quick waves, till his very heart seemed drained and empty, and he stood, nervelessly, helplessly, dumbly watching the child, bearing its accursed burden, with slow, relentless steps, nearer and nearer to the group that waited sheep-like to receive him. A fascinated curiosity compelled Lester to turn his head towards the fugitives. The cab had started at hot pace in the direction of the station. The next moment Lester was running faster than any of those present had ever seen a man run, and he was not running away. For that stray fraction of his life, some unwonted impulse beset him, some hint of the stock he came from, and he ran unflinchingly towards danger. He stooped and clutched at the Easter egg as one tries to scoop up the ball in rugby football. What he meant to do with it he had not considered. The thing was to get it. But the child had been promised cakes and sweetmeats if it safely gave the egg into the hands of the kindly old gentleman. It uttered no scream. It held to its charge with limpet grip. Lester sank to his knees, tugging savagely at the tightly clasped burden, and angry cries rose from the scandalized onlookers. A questioning, threatening ring formed round him, then shrank back in recoil as he shrieked out one hideous word. Lady Barbara heard the word and saw the crowd race away like scattered sheep, saw the prince forcibly hustled away by his attendants. Also, she saw her son lying prone in an agony of overmastering terror, his spasm of daring shattered by the child's unexpected resistance, still clutching frantically, as though for safety, at that white satin gewgaw, unable to crawl even from its deadly neighbourhood, able only to scream and scream and scream. In her brain she was dimly conscious of balancing, or striving to balance, the abject shame which had him now in thrall against the one compelling act of courage which had flung him grandly and madly onto the point of danger. It was only for the fraction of a minute that she stood watching the two entangled figures, the infant with its woodenly obstinate face and body tense with dogged resistance, and the boy, limp and already nearly dead with a terror that almost stifled his screams, and over them the long gala streamers flapping gaily in the sunshine. She never forgot the scene, but then it was the last she ever saw. Lady Barbara carries her scarred face with its sightless eyes as bravely as ever in the world, but at Eastertide her friends are careful to keep from her ears any mention of the children's Easter symbol. This audiobook was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.